What's up, everyone? My name's Anthony Pieri. I'm the pastor of Dot Church, and we are talking about deconstruction. Now, the word deconstruction has become kind of a buzzword. There's hundreds of Instagram and Twitter accounts that are devoted to deconstructing. We've seen these big famous Christians who all come out and tell these stories about how they've left their faith behind. And there's probably a good chunk of people who might be watching this who would consider themselves to be deconstructing their faith in some form or another. If you're unfamiliar with this idea, maybe you're thinking, what does that even mean? What is deconstruction? Well, deconstruction, it's the process of systematically examining an idea or a system and looking for ways that it's maybe biased or deceitful or unhealthy or maybe perpetuating oppression of some kind. While I think that people of all ages go through deconstruction, I think this is primarily a millennial phenomenon. As a millennial myself, I want to describe to you why I think this is such a prevalent problem in my age group. And I'm going to use a bunch of stereotypes in a row, but I think they're mostly based in reality. You have to understand that millennials were raised in the relentlessly optimistic environment of the late 80s and 90s. America had this booming economy, and our parents, who were mostly in the boomer category, taught us that we could achieve whatever we put our minds to. We were raised to believe that all the big institutions had our best interests in mind. We were told that if we got college degrees, there would be jobs waiting for us in whatever field we were passionate about. And this is why so many of us took on huge student loans to get degrees in anthropology or philosophy, because how cool would it be to be a philosopher for your career? But then we graduated college and there really weren't any jobs waiting for us in our fields. And then we realized that the banks that had promised us that student loans were the good kind of debt had actually lied. These loans were some of the worst, most binding kinds of loans that most of us will probably never get out of. Millennials were also old enough to remember 9/11, and we watched as our government invaded Iraq on a mostly spurious claim of WMDs, and then continued intervening in the Middle East, mainly for oil-related reasons. The government that we thought was there to keep us safe was actually a lot more self-interested than we had originally thought. We also lived through the housing crisis of 2008, and we watched as our parents had to deal with the fallout of taking on these massive mortgages that they couldn't afford. And then obviously more recently, we've watched as issues around justice have come to the forefront of our country's public conversation, whether related to race, sexuality, what the big tech companies have been doing, in terms of our data or surveillance or whatever, or even police brutality. Gen Z, the generation that came after millennials, they've lived through most of these events, but they've interpreted them very differently. Millennials have become incredibly disillusioned as we've realized that all these institutions not only have let us down, but they're actually relentlessly corrupt and self-interested. We've felt that we have been let down by all of them. But Gen Z, they grew up in this reality. They've never looked at the world through these same rose-colored glasses. When they pick a college major, they aren't asking, what am I passionate about? They're mainly asking, what is likely to give me a stable job at the end of this? I heard on a podcast that Gen Zs look at millennials and they ask them, why did you ever think a bank would have your best interest in mind? Millennials are engaging in this collective effort of deconstruction. After being let down in these tangible and visceral ways, we're now taking a hard look at the rest of the institutions to see what we find. If we were going to be naive originally to put our trust in these institutions, we wouldn't be so easily fooled the second time around. The whole fool me once, shame on me idea. You have to understand, though, that these collective series of disappointments, if you want to understand the religious deconstruction that we're seeing, many of us, we started looking back at our own religious upbringings as we entered adulthood, and we're realizing all these things. And what did we find? Did the church do any better than the banks that had swindled us into these student loans? Unfortunately, in many cases, the answer was no. We've talked about on Dot Church about the purity culture movement and how it led to massive amounts of shame that many millennials are still in therapy trying to recover from. We've watched as massively famous Christian celebrities and pastors have fallen into sexual scandals or financial scandals, or sometimes both of those things together. We've watched as churches have produced massive amounts of hate toward the LGBTQ community and immigrants and basically anyone who is different than the typical white evangelical Christian male. We've realized that these religious ideas taught to us in many of our churches were actually what Brian Loritz calls theology done in white. What many Christians presented as the only way to interpret the Bible was actually a distinctly white theology that completely discounted ideas of theologians of color. We were taught a very distinct way to read the Bible, that it's 100% error-free. It should be interpreted literally in all cases. And then we were given this choice to either reject science or reject Christianity. Now, am I painting with too broad a brush? Probably. If you're a millennial, does your experience match what I'm describing? Probably not perfectly, but even if not all of it fits your experience, what I'm describing should feel like familiar territory to you. Now, I want to pause for a second and ask a really important question. Is deconstruction a good or a bad thing? Depending on who you ask, you're going to get very different answers. Lots of pastors look at young people who are deconstructing and leaving the church, and they say, they just lack true faith. They're just too enamored with the culture around them. If they had just done their daily Bible study and prayer, this would have never happened. Social media is to blame, or maybe Netflix is to blame. But this really isn't the case, right? Because people who are leaving Christianity are leaving for real reasons. You can only endure so much without asking whether or not the root itself is poisoned. So I believe that there are clear and tangible benefits to deconstruct corrupt institutions. The church is not exempt from being scrutinized or being reformed. Some of the most famous Christians were called reformers for this very reason. They saw the corruption in their midst and they spoke out against it. But this is what I also want you to understand. Deconstruction is actually the second step in what potentially is a 3-step process. And if you stop at that second step of deconstruction, if you get stuck here, you can actually miss a massive opportunity. Now, the first step in this 3-step process is called construction. This is when the ideas of a group of people get codified and written down. These people get together, they start building institutions around these ideas. And people in this phrase believe that they have the right answers. They have clearly defined the categories, they've filled in all the boxes. And sometimes there's a degree of arrogance that comes from this stage. Like, how could someone not come to our conclusions, right? But then if at some point down the line, the institution itself becomes corrupt or oppressive, people will then move to the second step. And that step is called deconstruction. And remember, this is a good thing because it exposes how far things have gotten off track. But the problem is that many people get stuck here. They say, the Christianity I grew up with had so many problems that I need to walk away from it altogether. And while that is tempting, I do think it's premature. I think it's an example of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. There's actually a third stage of deconstruction. Now, before I tell you what it is, I want to give you the biblical basis for the 3 stages. This 3-stage process can be found, maybe surprisingly to some people, in the Bible itself, and not with some side character in some, corner of the Bible that isn't usually read or preached on, but actually it's one of the main passages about one of the most famous Christian leaders and church planters and missionaries of all time, the Apostle Paul himself. What you've got to understand is that when Paul grew up, he was in that construction phase. He got educated by this famous Jewish teacher named Gamaliel. You can read about that in Acts chapter 22. And then he went off to join the sect of the Pharisees, which was an elite group of religious leaders. He knew the history of his people back to front. He understood all the big theological ideas, and he believed that God had chosen his people, Israel, out of all the nations and tribes in the world to become his special people group. He knew the places where his group had gotten off track, and he saw himself as a reformer who was helping get the nation back on the right path. Like many people in this construction phase, he was convinced that he had understood and interpreted the Word of God accurately. He believed that the God of his ancestors wanted him to stop this new group of people called Christians who had claimed that this guy Jesus died and came back to life. And he believed that God would even approve of him using violence to stop them. Now, how does Paul move into the deconstruction phase? It actually comes from Jesus himself. At one point in his mission to stop this new Christian movement, Jesus appears to Paul in this bright, blinding light, and Paul becomes temporarily blinded. He can't see anything for 3 days, and he has to be led around by other people by the hand. And then God appears in this vision to this guy named Ananias, and he says, "Go and put your hands on Paul and heal him, and his sight will be restored." And the guy's like, "You want me to go talk to Paul? He was trying to kill us." But he does it, he trusts God, and then he puts his hands on him, and Paul is able to see again. And then Ananias tells Paul, listen, God has chosen you to spread the message of Jesus around the world. But here's the key factor. Paul doesn't actually start doing this right away. If you read this chapter in Acts, you can get the sense that Paul's deconstruction, it only lasts for a couple days or, not very long. But that's not actually what we see in one of Paul's later letters. Paul writes about his experience in this letter to the church in Galatia. And we'll read this on the screen. For you have heard of my previous way of life in Judaism, how intensely I persecuted the church of God and tried to destroy it. I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people, and was extremely zealous for the tradition of my fathers. But when God, who set me apart from my mother's womb and called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son in me that I might preach him among the Gentiles, my immediate response was not to consult any human being. I did not go to Jerusalem to see those who were apostles before I was, but I went into Arabia. Later, I returned to Damascus. Now, I don't want you to miss that last sentence because there's a lot packed into it. That's something that we can usually just breeze past. But there's a scholar named N.T. Wright. He's one of the main scholars who talks about Paul. And he says this last sentence, I went back into Arabia, is packed with meaning. He believes that in Arabia, Paul went to Mount Sinai to hear from God directly. Because what you have to understand is that Paul saw himself in the tradition of the great prophets, especially the prophet Elijah. When Elijah felt lost and alone, he also went up to that mountain to hear from God, to help sort through what he was wrestling with. This is also the same mountain where Moses received the 10 Commandments from God directly in the book of Exodus. And so Paul, he goes to seek God, and then he actually spends several years rethinking, reimagining how he had been reading the scriptures. And in that process, Paul realizes that the story that he had been following his entire life wasn't true, or at least it wasn't true in the way that he thought it was true. He believed that God would send a political leader who would use violence and military power to free the Jewish people from the Roman government. He believed that God would only send this leader if their people adhered very closely to the Jewish laws and remained as faithful as possible. He believed that this new movement of Christians threatened all of it. Now, we need to pause for a second and see some parallels about Christians today. There are Christians in America today who think very similar things, and they have ideas that need to be deconstructed. There are Christians today who believe that the United States is God's divine nation and that we need to use violence in order to ensure that we can keep our religious freedom. There's Christians who look at what's happening in America and they blame it on people not reading their Bibles enough or taking prayer out of schools, in the same way that Paul would look at these people and then blame any problems around it, saying you aren't following the commandments enough and that's why God is not delivering us. But Paul, he has this experience where he meets Jesus directly. And this Jesus that he meets, it's not a Jesus of military power who uses that to bring about freedom, but he uses actually sacrifice and humility and love for people who are different than him and the Israelites themselves. And Jesus' goal was not to free his people from political powers, but to free all people from the power of sin and death. Paul realizes he's been interpreting this story wrong. And that's why I don't believe that it's fair to say that Paul converted to Christianity. More that he deconstructed his previous understanding and then reconstructed a faith that was actually more true to the scriptures and the stories that he had read and studied his entire life. So during this time, and it lasted several years, Paul rereads and reinterprets how he's read and understood the Bible. It's during this time he becomes a tent maker. He takes on this blue-collar trade to earn a living, and then he spends his days thinking and discussing these ideas with anyone who will listen before he ever enters back into more formal ministry. Paul goes through all three stages: construction, deconstruction, and finally this third stage of reconstruction. And it's in this last stage that leads to the most fruit. We can trace our churches back to Paul and his missionary efforts. He could have stayed in this deconstruction and spent the rest of his days in solitude, but he didn't. He engaged in the hard work of reimagining how he had been understanding his faith. And it led us on this very day to day to be in churches together, making videos like this and meeting on Zoom, talking about Jesus. A lot of it can be traced directly back to Paul. Now, I firmly believe that the church as a group of people and as a formal institution, I know that's a kind of a dirty word for a lot of people. Institutions seem bad, right? But I believe that as a people and an institution, it is the hope of the world and the plan A of God. Has the church gotten off track in the U.S.? 100%. But does this mean that it needs to be completely discarded and thrown away? I don't think so. What if we as humans will always take good institutions and corrupt them? What if the answer is not to destroy them or leave them behind for good, but to reform them, to deconstruct what needs to be deconstructed, but then to reconstruct these churches and places into what God actually intended? I want you to imagine that God is actually guiding the deconstruction of the church in America. That when you look at the church and you see all the problems, that God also sees them and is actually more angry about them than you are. I want you to imagine that God is not disappointed at you for wrestling through these stages of deconstruction, but he also does not want you to get stuck here. He wants you to move to that third step of reconstruction. The point of Dot Church is to help you on that path through deconstruction in all of its messiness and on towards reconstruction. This is the reason that we're not afraid to talk about the horrors of the American church. These things that are not of Jesus need to be left behind. But the reason we come together every Tuesday night and meet on Zoom and make these videos is because we believe that Jesus and the communities that form around his name are the answer. And a community of people trying to follow Jesus together can overcome any of the hardships of this life. And if you are deconstructing, there's no time limit for how fast you need to move through this stage. You can be in this stage for a long time. That's completely okay. We are not trying to rush you. Just know that as you're in this stage, you are covered with grace as you ask questions and doubt and wrestle. But we want to help guide you through that process towards reconstruction, because that is where the real fruit begins. If you have any questions or anything, feel free to leave it in the comments below. And if you enjoy this video, please consider liking and subscribing.